Welcome to the University of Essex, our Space to Grow programme on investment readiness. My name is John Stenhouse and I have with me Josh Clark, and we're here to take you through the investment readiness programme to get you ready for equity investment. I would now introduce you to our two entrepreneurs in residence. Now, our entrepreneurs in residence, or fellows of the university, if you like, are here as experts in their own fields. We have Nitin Patel and William Millar, who have been guiding founders through the process of investment readiness on our Angels at Essex platform by providing one-to-one mentoring support and help and guidance in preparing pitch decks. Now, bearing in mind our Angels at Essex platform has raised over 3.5 million since its inception last May, we're not doing too bad for a newbie on the block. And it's the experience of the team behind it which has made that happen. So as a new business ourselves, we have actually made an impact into the local economy. So I would now like to introduce Nitin Patel and William Millar, who are going to take over the webinar. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is William Millar, and this afternoon we're going to take you through some questions that you may want to ask of yourself and answer when you're starting up a business and before you seek any investment funding. So the agenda for the afternoon is we're going to talk about the idea. All businesses start with an idea, but it really needs some qualification to make sure that your idea is a good one. And then we're going to talk about the markets and customers. We need to know who you're going to sell your product and service to. So you want to understand the customers, where they are and who they are. And every idea ought to be unique, ought to have something in it that separates it out from the rest of the competition. So we talk a bit about the intellectual property and how that might be in your business and how you might go about protecting it. Then, assuming that all of those questions can be answered successfully, you want to plan for success and you want to plan for a growing business. So we'll talk about making it all work, what you've got to do to put in place to make that business work. And finally, now we've got a good idea, a good business opportunity, we know the customers, we know how to make it work. So we're going to then look at who will give you money to make that all happen.
Okay, let me talk through the process that we're going to sort of make you think about the idea that you have come up with. And if you look at the first 3 points on this slide, they're all sort of interlinked. A good idea is one that has a solution to a problem, and the problem is addressed, has the key area of your idea. So the evaluation really of your business idea needs to address a specific problem that you know of, which is why if you look further down the slide, it's also originates a lot of times from your experience. And what we found during our sort of work that we've done over the last year is most of the problems that really have a good solution are problems that people face from the experience that they've had, either through working or either through experiencing something that they use on a regular basis. So it's always important to actually understand the usability of anything that you are going to provide as a solution to a problem that you've seen. So the story part of getting your idea up and running, we always find works really well when the problem comes because of your knowledge of that field, function, industry. So that's a big part of being an entrepreneur, taking something that you think is going to solve a problem that you see. And a big part of developing that is actually being able to frame that so it's understandable to other people when you go across to the side of looking for investment, looking for people to support the idea, looking for other people to join your team. So it's a very big part of that. And we like to think when you're making the investment deck, when we talk about it later, you can form that as part of the overall story. The next part, if you see further down in the last 2 points, are really about will it work or won't it work? And that is partly a process that you will only discover when you've gone somewhere towards developing that in a bit more of a solid state. Because sometimes, as we know, not all ideas have a solution or a requirement right at the start, but that doesn't necessarily make it a bad idea. But what it does need is a problem to solve. So it's a sort of circular discussion on, is there a business in the idea? But what we've tried to do is highlight some of the key areas that you really need to think about. And they're hard to think about for yourself. So sometimes it's better to discuss it with someone else who can give you some input. And as I said, following that sort of stuff, you can sort of look at your experience, and is it an open innovation competition that you're part of, which is an area where ideas are generated. It's a process, or you've come up with your own idea. So, but overall, I think some of the items we've said here are some of the things you really need to think about deeply before you go running down a path of creating a business.
But here's a couple of reasons why it's important to get your product idea correct. So on the left, we have the Razor phone, which was produced by a Chinese company in 2009. And that features an electric shaver head at the bottom, which is hidden away under a plastic cover and is apparently able to power full shave when the battery is fully charged. Now, you might ask, why on earth would anybody want to create a phone with a razor built into it? And that's a question to which I don't have an answer. I have my suspicions that around that time, Motorola introduced the Razor phone, spelled R-A-Z-R. That was their trade name. And I wonder if some Chinese marketing person thought, the Americans are introducing Razor phones, let's us introduce a Razor phone, but got the concept wrong. I have no idea, and I'm probably doing somebody a disservice. But it just says, just because you can do something doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good thing to do. On the other side, there's the comment that was made by Steve Ballmer in 2007 when Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone. And lots of people today look back at that and say, well, Steve Ballmer got it wrong, but he was actually making a comment on the iPhone itself, because at that time, Jobs was introducing a thing that was a phone, a thing that was an iPod, and a thing that was his internet communication device. And what Ballmer was saying was that that product is overpriced and it's too expensive for the market and it's not sufficiently feature rich. And that's why he said what he said. Now, Apple went on then to improve the iPhone product, not necessarily as a result of Steve Ballmer's criticism, but they recognized it was something that they put into the market that did need improvement, and they went on then to make the great success of it that it is today. So it's important to understand your product, understand the market that you're working in and what features you're offering and why people will buy it. So Nitin,
Yeah. So up to now, we've sort of talked about idea, making sure it's a good idea, not always getting put off by something in the market that says it may not be a good idea. But the key to a successful business is being able to define the market or even create it. But with all of that, you need customers. So you've really got to be able to assess or even predict and forecast who are your buyers for your idea and will they buy it? And they're two separate things, because there's lots of things that we like the thought of, but can we actually afford to buy it? So they have to be balanced. And that's one of the key to getting a business startup up and running, being able to create it into a growing business. And it's pitching some of those things at the right audience. Now, as we said, you need customers, and the best way of assessing the need, as I said, a lot of times comes from your own knowledge of the experiences from where you're looking at this idea and where you see that the idea is solving a problem. So that will give you an ability to sort of understand whether there is someone who will willingly buy it, because you're one of the guys who've been part of that industry or experienced who said, if there was something different, I would buy it. So in a way, you're a good judge, but you've got to make sure that that judgment is put across to other people, and that's where defining that problem and giving that solution is a key. But to add to those things, you've got to be able to market, and that's a big challenge in the day where, you know, there is so much ability for us to communicate either directly or through other media. So as part of the process, not necessarily the first part of starting a business, but certainly in hand with moving the business along, is understanding how best to get that message across to the audience you've got, and also how you're going to encourage people to pay you some money for that product. So it's a mixed strategy of product, market, and buyers, but making sure that there's a benefit for all of the guys involved in that chain, which is how you then get people to buy into your concept. I mean, there's a whole lot of specific points there that you have to look at. And when you actually create the process to evaluate your idea in depth, you go through all of these things in terms of market size, who you're going to sell through into that, in that market, what is the current way it's being done, your sales strategy in terms of, you know, is it going to be direct selling? Is it going through third party, or is it going through distribution, or even consumer direct through stores and stuff? So it's all based around your idea, your audience, and your understanding at that stage of, you know, whether you want to be part of that industry doing the things but doing it better, or are you going to be part of that industry but doing it totally differently and take a big risk. Neither is wrong. It's your ability to actually get that done. It is what comes along once you've got the idea to a reasonable base that it's workable. Bill?
Okay, well, move on into the next slide, which is a couple of examples of really good and bad marketing and marketing activities. They've almost become case studies in their own right. So Coca-Cola back the late 80s, early 90s was losing market share to Pepsi, and Coke being a global brand and having a global presence wanted to do something about that. So they got some focus groups in, and people said that they preferred the sweeter taste of Pepsi. So they decided to improve the brand, the drink that they had, and they created a thing called New Coke at the end of the 80s, early 90s. But the problem was that while lots of people accepted it, many other people didn't like the new, better formula and demanded the old one back, and which Coke rapidly did. So within a few months of making the change, they changed back again, but they didn't take the new Coke off the market until much later, and the old formula came back as Coca-Cola Classic. So that's a salutary tale in that if you've got something that's working and it's a well-established and successful brand, then it might not need fixing because it wasn't really broken in the first place. So you have to be very careful what you do if you do get a brand established with that brand and how your marketing reflects it. On the other side, this Red Bull is an Austrian energy drink, which came into being again around the same time at 1987. And you'll know that today it's become an established market leader. But at the time when it started up, Red Bull didn't have much money for marketing. In fact, it was started by a toothpaste salesman and a Thai pharmacist. The pharmacist has had the formula for the drink, and the toothpaste salesman reckoned this would be a good thing to introduce in Europe. So they started off, but the way, without the budget, they weren't able to do traditional marketing, advertising, and on television and radio and things like that there. But what they did do was carefully look at who their ideal customers would be. They developed their customer persona, and that turned out to be people of the age 18 to 34, both male and female. They were average to high income earners. and they had a preference for sports participation or spectating. And so Red Bull went along to places where this group of people would gather and would do things like give away free samples, and they would just be part of the whole experience of being involved in those kinds of events. And gradually, as they got older and grew more revenue, then they began to sponsor their own events and sponsor racing teams and football clubs. In fact, they own some football clubs, as used influencers. And all the while, they're not talking about the product itself, but they're talking and giving you the whole idea of the experience that you can have when you drink Red Bull. So very little about the product, but it's become a really market. It is a market leader in its field. And one of the big events that they did was the Stratus event, where the Austrian skydiver went to the edge of the stratosphere and jumped off the helium balloon, and it took him something like, what was it, 19 minutes to get to Earth, which was all streamed live on YouTube. 52 people watched it while it was live, and the coverage of that event was worth tens of billions of pounds in any advertising budget. So the lesson here is, be true to your brand, use marketing activities that are true to that, experiment with different forms of marketing, but understand what that's doing, and inspire your customers. Of course, the advantage that they have is that Red Bull only makes one product. It is Red Bull, there's nothing else. So there's no opportunity to dilute any of their marketing activity. It's all there through events and being involved in those kinds of things to promote the product itself. Ultimately, the idea is to sell the product, but they don't sell it, they sell the experience. So we'll move on to talk about intellectual property and protecting the idea that you have. So we've said that in general, you want your realization of the idea to be different from everybody else, because that's what gives you your unique selling point within the marketplace itself. And if you have that, then you don't really want anybody else to copy it. So can you protect what you've got? Now, there are various protection methods that are open to you. You could apply for a patent on what you've got. You could also try trademarking something, or you may have a design that you want to register. And these protection methods do exist. Those are all the ones you have to apply for. You'll automatically get copyright protection on certain elements of the business as well. So you really have to look and see if there's something inventive in what you're doing to see if you can patent it. And that would, you can then register that patent, and that gives you some right of ownership of the ideas that are in there. Of course, the other side of that is that while you have the patent, you will have to be able to defend it. So having the patent doesn't actually stop anybody from copying it. You have to find out that they are copying it and then challenge them about that. Now, some people starting up a business may decide that they don't want to go to the expense of patenting and what they're doing, because patenting does two things. One, it costs you money, and if you don't have a lot of money, then you may choose not to patent it. That may not be a good reason, but another reason for not patenting is that it does publish what you're doing, so it puts it into the public domain when the patent is published, and tells other people how you're doing it. So therefore, some people choose not to produce that patent simply for the whole idea of protecting what they're doing. The important thing is, if you do think that you are going to patent something, then it has to be kept secret until such times as the patent is published, which means you can't talk about it really to anybody else, or you can't publish it in a trade magazine or anything like that, because that discloses it and makes it public. If you do have to talk to anybody about it, then you can ask them to sign a non-disclosure agreement. You may have some trade secrets or some recipe in what you're doing that makes it difficult for others to copy. And if you decide not to take up any protection, then you need to get into the market quickly and establish yourself so that you're the known brand for that particular piece of functionality embedded in the product or the service that you're offering. And I've mentioned earlier that you have the opportunity of trademarking what you're doing, or you could register a design, and copyright comes automatically with anything that you write or protect or write or create in a written form. Intellectual property and its protection is a complex area, and therefore you ought to really seek some professional advice on what you're doing. But the Intellectual Property Office, which is part of the government, offers a lot of expert support and advice for free. It's got a lot of online resources. It's even got people at the end of the phone that you can speak to and sort of sign them out on what might be possible. So if you go to their website, you can get links to all of that material that's present. And sometimes it's useful just to go through some training courses that they have that are free, so that you understand what you're talking about and what the possibilities are. So Nitin, I don't know, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you've covered a lot of that. Thanks.
Right. Okay, so we'll go on to the next slide. And you might think, oh, well, this isn't really a problem for me and my business, but here's a couple of examples, a small one and a large one. So two ladies in Ipswich, Hannah Huntley and Beth Cook, they're both sisters. They launched a company called Baker and Barista in Ipswich in 2013 in St. Peter's Street. And they called the company Baker and Barista, and unknown to them, there was another English company based in Surrey that owned the trademark name Barista and Baker. And what eventually that company, Elior, did was they wrote to the two sisters to say that you're actually passing yourself off as our company because the name's so close to what we were doing. Now, the girls didn't know that there was another company there, so they didn't know they were doing anything wrong, and this came as a bit of a surprise to them. But because they were a small company, Elior took a lenient view and gave them plenty of time to change the name of the company, but the name of the company had to be changed. And so they had to then close that shop for a weekend and do all their rebranding. So we changed the signage, changed all the printed material, and it's been changed to Applaud. Still going strong in Ipswich, does very nice cakes when it's open, and some of them you can take away at the minute, all baked on the premises, good coffee, and they have a second shop there. And I think that's what marketing people call advocacy. I can thoroughly recommend them. On the other side of the coin, then there, you would think that large companies would have their IP sorted out, but Apple, who used Qualcomm chips. Qualcomm's made in Germany. I think a German company makes the chips that access the wireless network, and one of the main suppliers of that kind of technology. Apple decided that they were charging too much for the chip and the licensing fee that went with it. So in order to use the chip, you also had to buy the license to use the technology from Qualcomm, and that's part of the deal. And Apple then went on to well, it stopped paying the license fee because it said it was too much, and Qualcomm then sued Apple in Germany for that money, and Apple in turn countersued because they said that this was a dominating company in the marketplace and it was unfair, and they sued them in the States, in Germany, in China, and various other countries throughout the world. So they started that exercise in 2017, in the summer of 2017, and 2 years later then they settled before they went to court, and with the result that Apple then continued to use Qualcomm chips. It's paid Qualcomm a sum of money to represent the money they hadn't paid them so far, and they went into another 6-year deal. Meanwhile, Apple had acquired Intel to use its wireless technology and bought up a lot of patents from Intel. So that, as you can imagine, must have cost both companies a lot of money to take all of that legal action. So this is one of the things to be aware of, that if your IP strategy and IP isn't correct, that it can cost you a lot of money to put it right. So
okay. Yeah, taking it from there, as we say in a lot of cases, some of the work you have to do in most things is to think and plan, and then you have to do it. So this is about doing it. This is about making the whole sort of thought process you've gone to previous to this and making it all work. And there are a number of key areas that you have to think about at this stage. What has to be made? Do you want to do it yourself, or should you be outsourcing? That really needs to tie in with a little bit of what William had just explained before. If you are going to be first in the market and it's not protectable, then it may be a good idea, certainly at the start, to keep everything under your own control, so you're not showing anyone else what you're planning to bring out. That's a high cost investment at that stage, but it depends, on how big the idea is, how much you see the benefit of keeping it under wraps for a long period before you bring it out, or how challenging could it be for you if other people could see the idea before you've been implementing it. So that's part of the decision making, in terms of either you do it yourself or you outsourcing. Either way, you've got to manage the supplier, whether it's parts that you're buying off them or whether it's the whole component that is a big piece of your project. And so at an early stage, as much as it's seen that buying and sourcing are sort of operational things, it's also important that at this stage, when you're ready to make things, you start thinking about that, and also work with suppliers that you build relationships with. Ensure that any information you provide them isn't going to be used by themselves, and all of those sort of basic things. But it's all part of that early stage. And I know a lot of times you don't really have a control of being able to do this, but you certainly need to be able to think through this. And if the risks are too high, then don't do it, because there's no point doing something and regretting it later on. That's the whole thought process that we are trying to encourage here. And if you're talking about other things like outsourcing software, creating a prototype, it's all comes down to how much protection do you think gives you an advantage, and the abilities you have as well. One of the things we like to think about for early stage startups on software, it's important that within your team you have some serious capability if you are going to code things or have it coded outside, because you really do need to own that, because third parties sourcing businesses will be what they are, that they will serve the customers who have the biggest demand for them. So I think we tend to sort of really question people who say, I've got an idea of creating a piece of software, but we're going to outsource it all. And I think from an investment point of view, you have a big challenge, because there's a reputation around creating software that's always late or always out of cost. So you've got to really work these things out at the time that you are thinking about going into the next stage of your thought process for creating a business. And then obviously you've got the next two stages at the bottom there, which are pilot and trials. And by that time, you're a long way down creating your venture. It's also at the time that if you've managed it right, you have some potential areas that you knew you wanted to get some feedback on, and you'll be able to change. So you create the situation that it allows you at that stage to do that. And also use any information, any feedback you get to improve things. And the final one is not necessarily at this stage a key, but it's certainly a key as you start getting customers on board. And that customer service and support is going to be part of your brand going forward. So it's important that you think about it, you see how you can do it in the short term by using someone else, how you see it implemented it in the long term. I know some of these things may seem a long way away for some of the people who are thinking about starting up, but it's important that we know these things matter in terms of how fast the business grows and how much investment they're likely to get as they're growing.
Just to emphasize that point, here's one that's topical at the moment. You can no longer sit on your sofa watching the television without being bombarded with an advertisement for Peloton or similar machine. But Peloton had created a huge demand for the machine, and this New York Times article actually points out that one of the problems that they've got in creating that demand was their inability to supply the machines in a timely fashion to meet the expectations of customers. And so in January, the article was saying that people had ordered them as far back as October, expecting them for the November holidays in the States or for Christmas and New Year elsewhere. And what this was doing was actually causing damage to the brand itself. And while social media can be a good friend of new businesses and helping them promote their ideas, you can see that Facebook and Reddit and Twitter all had groups contributing to discussing the delivery issues and reporting complaints that people had with their deliveries. So just to emphasize that it is important that if you do create a business and you plan for success in sales, you ought to be also planning for success and being able to deliver to meet those sales and not sort of expect that to happen as sales come in. Now I know that some people say, well, we need the sales to get the money in to grow the business, but you've got to take that all into account as you plan out the business and look for funding to cover any shortfall you might have with your operational needs.
Okay, so you've done a lot of the planning, you've done a lot of the thinking, you've started the process of how you're going to get it into the market, how you're going to build it, and then the next stage of that is how do you fund it? And what we've done here is put some of the more popular ways of how people have funded the business. And certainly the one at the top, which is really for the early stage of getting funding, is through friends and families. There's almost sometimes a question from other investors as to how much did you get from there, because it's sort of proof that you really believe in your own idea to ask friends and your family to invest. I'm not sure how much of that is a myth or whether it's real, but you should almost understand what they're asking there is, if you're not going to invest or you don't think other people you know close should invest, then why are you asking other people? So it's very important that you get a balance of how you start that business. The rest of the ideas about how you finance are pretty easy to deal with. Debt is, finding someone who does work in the area of startup loans. That again is quite a challenging situation for business to get into. But again, it depends on how strong your proposition is, how much commitment you think you've already got from customers. And it's a good way of doing it to keep your business totally owned by yourself. The next stage is grants, and currently there is a wide variety of grants available for unique businesses within sectors, and there is a lot of potential for early stage startups to get grants, but also on the same basis there's a lot of competition as to who gets them. So you need to really get to understand whether the grants make for your type of venture and whether your venture will stand up to the scrutiny of the rules of the grant. So you do have to do some pre-work and then understand whether you're eligible. The one that seems to be the most popular potential investment option for most people is equity investment. And this is a real challenge in the one sense that, if you're going to get people to invest in what is, in a lot of cases, an idea with a lot of work done around it, it has really got to be able to get across why someone is going to put money in there and what the benefits for them to do that. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as part of our earlier seminars and webinars have been all about getting equity investment. And finally, you see two more options: crowdfunding, which I think most people on this webinar would have heard about, and then there's the more sophisticated banking loans that people of a bigger business can get through the British Business Bank. Okay, Bill. Okay, so this is one of the key areas and the fundamental things that we've been doing on this program, and really getting people to create a situation through their deck that they can get interested investors to talk to them. And one of the things that we said, tell your story. And what we've got here is 11 points that we think need to be part of that pitch deck. And it starts with the problem and it sort of finishes it with the current status. And in between, you've got various options of things you've got to put in depending on your audience. But certainly this is meant to get to investors and also for businesses who've actually got to a stage where they're very much got something to show. So you've got to be at the prototype state, either in software terms or in physical product terms. You've got to be able to show that, you know, up to that point, your team has the capabilities of dealing with what you've done, but also moving to the next stage, which may require you using the funding for things you've not necessarily been doing at that stage. And sometimes that's things like marketing, creating a sales organization, or even using, you know, other things that normally aren't in their sort of normal skill sets. So that's the importance of the pitch deck, and the importance of getting that message across to the investor that even though you haven't done it within the team, you have the capabilities. And that brings me to another point at number 10, which is the team. It's not necessarily number 10 on the list of importance. It's just where we think it's right, because what we want you to leave the investor with is the team members and their skill sets, and why they're the people, even though you've told them what you're doing, you've done what you say, that these guys have the capacity and the capability to ensuring that you are going to take that money from them and invest it in the right things to make it grow for them. So I don't really want to get through all of that in detail, because I think there's webinars on there, but it is one of the key points that once you've developed some of the things we've said up to this point, that you really understand the content of what you're saying and do the detailed work behind the content. So when you are speaking, you exactly know the facts, and market opportunities, revenue projection should be done from a very base standard. So you can really say, you know, I'm only looking for small parts of the market to get engaged with me. And to a certain extent, Bill can add to this, but he always says, build your forecast from bottom up. And that shows the knowledge you have of potentially how many customers you can get rather than a percentage. Bill, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, well, it goes back to what we said earlier about the working out who your ideal customer persona is. So identify what the who the customer is that you're aiming your product or service at, and then work out, you know, how many of those you can see locally. You may want to then buy some databases that give you a wider view of how many potential sales opportunities there are, and you can gradually build that up from the bottom, and you can think, well, this is the number that I can sell to this month, next month, and the month after, and hence you've got a plan for your sales that are going to be made or estimated over a period of time, and therefore it makes it much more real than starting at the top and saying the total market opportunity is X millions and I can attack 10% of that or 5% of that in a certain time period. So it's trying to just build it from the bottom, understand who you're going to sell to and how many you're going to sell to over a period of time. And the only other comment to make on this slide, that while it's focused on a pitch deck, the same kind of information is asked for by people who will lend you money, and they'll look for that in the business plan. Then the same kind of information is asked for by people who will be offering grants. So I'll move on and just talk a little bit about grants. Because people may or may not know they exist. There's a sort of a view that grants are some kind of free money that's available to people, where grants are really investments made by an awarding body to allow that business to achieve a specific objective. And it could be to something like to employ more people, or it could be to bring our new product or service into the marketplace. So you have to understand really what the grant is about. Common question that comes up, does a grant have to be repaid? And the answer to that is no. A grant being successfully awarded and is successfully meeting the objectives means that it doesn't have to be repaid. However, it could be reclaimed if the objective wasn't achieved. Rarely happens because most people apply for grants in good faith and achieve the objectives, but for some reason, if in the odd occasion when the objective wasn't achieved, then the grant could be reclaimed. Startup businesses tend to find it difficult to attract a grant, a general grant, because they haven't got a trading history, and that just makes it difficult for them. But there are a wide range of grants available, as Nitin says. There are European Union grants, national grants, regional, and even some cases local grant bodies have got money to give away through local authorities. To get a grant, you have to fill in an application form, and you really need to understand what the questions are that are being asked and how you should address them. And if you are applying for something like an Innovate UK grant, then you should make use of the services that are available in Innovate UK Edge, which is part of Innovate UK itself, who will help you with webinars and with expert advice how to answer the questions that are in the grant. They won't answer them for you, but they'll help you with that. Indeed, they have some online resources that help with that. If you want to find out more, then a good place to go to is your local growth hub. Every region in England has a growth hub associated with it, and they've got expert advisors in there who can point you in the right direction for a grant. And the last thing to say about a grant itself is only apply for it if it fits in with what you're doing. Don't apply for it because it's there, because you'll have to bend your business to fit the grant, and that's not what you want to do. You want to keep your business going in the direction that you want to take it. And therefore, if there's a grant that helps you along the way, then that's something that you could apply for. The added advantage of applying for and being awarded a grant is that it means that somebody else has done some due diligence on what you're doing and decides that it's worth awarding a grant to. So it gives you another tick in the box really for how good the product or service is when you come to look for investment. And the other thing to say is that the government also supports businesses taking some risks and doing some innovation through R&D tax credits. So it's worthwhile investigating those either through your accountant or through yourself or through any specialist organization that helps claim R&D tax credits. And just to finish up on that topic, looking at Innovate UK grants that were awarded with the start date in 2020, how does this region do in that? So looking at the New Anglia LEP, which covers Norfolk and Suffolk, and South East LEP covering Kent and Essex, you can see there that I think there's 134 grants that were awarded with the start date in 2020. That was a total value of almost £22 million. And the micro and small grants, the micro and small enterprise value of that, percentage of that was 69%. So you can see that micro and small businesses do well in getting Innovate UK grants and better than everybody else combined. Micro business is one that employs less than 10 people, small 50 people or less, and the medium-sized business is between 50 and 250 people. So Innovate UK grants are competitive, highly competitive. You need to know what you're doing when you apply for them, but they are available, and micro and small businesses do attract and receive money from Innovate UK, which helps them get started in the technical area in the business that they're working in. So I think that brings us to the end. And so we'll take questions now. If you want to get in touch with us, use the email address uez@essex.ac.uk.
Thank you very much there, William and Nitin. We have got a few questions from the box, and the first one actually from Benjamin Pam, who's saying Steve Jobs famously said he did not do market research. I'm not necessarily believing that. Would it be accurate to say he created the market for his products? So we're talking blue ocean here. And how was he able to achieve this?
Well, I think he did a bit of both. He didn't use the term, but he already had products out there that he got information back on. So that was his own sort of take on, why things were working or not. And to a certain extent, though, Benjamin, I do agree with you that if it was that easy that you just sort of, do it by numbers, then everyone can do it. What I certainly personally used to use market research for was getting the ideas and understanding that what I was thinking was in line with what the market was sort of likely to accept, but not necessarily take the answers as gospel. So I think it's also about your own personality and your own mindset. So your question is, does it always sort of work and you always have to do it? I think it's more about finding the right situation and what works for you.
And I would also add, say if you're bringing a new product or service to market, what problem is it solving? Because that makes life a lot simpler. If there is no problem that it solves, then you have a harder uphill battle to bring it to market.
Yeah,
I
think Jobs was also good at understanding how users would use his devices as well. So things like bringing in the mouse into the computer and the different interfaces that he had on the iPod, and then the large screen and doing away with the keypad. The button keypad for the phones. Those were all innovations that he brought into the marketplace. But in some sense, the market research had already been done, in that's what he knew that people would want to use. So that's not doing him a disservice or anything like that. I think he's very clever at those kinds of things as well.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions from Majid Ali. Revenue projection is based on benchmarking, or we have another tool. Let's talk about revenue projection, especially revenue projection when there is an established market. How do we approach that?
Well, I would go back to my view as understanding what it is that you're selling and who you're selling it to, and then how many of those customers do you think that you can sell to in a certain time, and build it up from the bottom up and understand then, how the revenue projection is growing from over time. Understand as well if you've got the resources to sell to that number of people, and do you need more people to sell it, or how, if it's a software as a service type thing, how are you going to scale to meet the market demand? And that's why I like to work from the bottom up, understand the numbers. It's useful to know how big the marketplace is to see that it's worthwhile entering it. But then if you've decided to enter it, you've got to know almost in a nuts and bolts fashion how you're going to sell, identify the customers, identify the numbers, and have the resources to meet that demand through sales and your sales strategy.
Often you will find that investors, when they're looking at your projections, they may very well decide to halve your perception of what the marketplace would actually be, because that gives them a better understanding of your aspirations and also where their level of investment return would actually kick in. Another question from Majid with regards to startup: what's the best way to cover legal expenses? Would you recommend hire a full-time solicitor, or should be just outsourced? And what would be the safest choice? Have you got any comments on that?
Yeah, it depends on your startup and where you're doing it as well, because a lot of early stage startup situations now, particularly when you're say linked with a university like ours, or even some of the stuff that's going on the market, would have that sort of early stage support, and certainly encourage you to look at some of the information and some of the things you can do for yourself, unless you have reached a certain stage. So when Bill talked about IP, I think if you really believe you've got a strong case for an IP and a patent, that's when you start talking to a lawyer, because they start clocking on money every time you talk to them, but it's worth the money because they have the expertise to make sure you get the best protection for your product. So the answer isn't straightforward as you may like, because I think there's so many tools and information around at the moment in this area that a lot of cases, you can answer some of the early stage questions by following what's already existing from places like Seeders, crowdfunding, other sort of startup areas. Once you reach that point where you're in the space of saying, I've got a product, I'm going to bring it out, I need to agree some contracts with suppliers and that type of thing, I think that's when you start thinking about developing that relationship with a solicitor. And I don't understand when you mean, do I outsource it or do I wouldn't employ a solicitor at the startup stage. So if you're saying, do you use someone, I think that's the only option you really have, unless you employ him full time, which wouldn't be the case. So that would be my take, that you try and do a lot of things yourself at that stage. You follow some of the information that's already existing, and then when you reach some real complicated things, and you're in a place where you can see the benefits of solving those by paying someone, is when you start. Because what you don't want to do is get yourself in a reasonable sized debt, which you can do using solicitors too early.
I agree. A final question, and we'll have to keep this quite brief. How would you approach the selling of a service rather than a product?
Well, I mean, a service is a service, and you need to, like a product, you need to understand what the benefits are that it's going to provide for someone. And so that's your opening point. You need to have in the background all of the elements of customer service that you are going to need in order to provide that in place. So you need to understand from the customer what it is that they want and value in that service that you're providing, and make sure that you can meet it, would be my take on that.
Yes, they basically, the basic principles apply to both a service and a product. The only difference is a product is a tangible and a service tends to be an intangible. However, the rule is it's got to satisfy a need, and therefore your service has got to satisfy a need, your product has got to satisfy a need. Once you get those clear, then actually explaining them is a lot easier. The final question in there was, when you know that you've got a viable project, where do you go next? Well, you come and talk to us, because we're here to help you take viable projects to the market. So for those who have asked for more help and support, uez@essex.ac.uk. Post your questions there and we will be pleased to assist you further. It goes without saying that I thank William Millar and Nitin Patel for their presentation today, for Josh Clark for assisting with all the technical side and the polls, and myself, John Stenhouse, thanks you personally for attending today. Please look out for our next series of webinars. This one was recorded and will be placed on YouTube later as soon as it's edited. And thank you once again. This has been the University of Essex Investment Readiness from the University Enterprise Zone. Thank you and goodbye.